Thank you, everybody, for coming out this Saturday afternoon. I'm sure it's so nice out there. We've all got stuff we could do in the yard. But thank you for coming to hear Margo. She's back. We're happy to have her back. Many of you might have been here when she came and talked about her first book. Now she's got a new book, and she came all the way down from D.C. This beautiful day just to talk to us about it and what she's doing in the future, too. So, Margo Williams.
Thank you. I love coming to Randolph County. This is why I love coming to Randolph County. This is, you're my family. I love Randolph County history, and I love sharing it, and I always love that everyone who comes and that I meet, even just perchance, is always so enthusiastic also. So this is always a treat for me. I just love it. So I'm happy to be here. Thank you so much. And I'm curious. I know I have family members in the audience. You want to raise your hands? And there's more family members than that in the audience. Yeah. Jeez, Susan, come on, thanks. And of course, how many of you actually know anything about where Strieby is? Have you been down there? You've seen it, you know? Okay, so most people do have some idea of where it is. That's great. As I'm usually talking to people, I'm explaining that it's back in the woods, back in the country, and that it's not a place you would just sort of come across just so. As most of you know, and I know there are trailblazers here, it's currently in the Uwharrie National Forest, and that for folks up my way, they're quite surprised when they see what a large area that is, and I tell them that we're, inside there, not on the fringes, but really in it. Well, as you know, I call it from Hilltown to Strieby because originally the area was called Hilltown. There were a large number, there was a large hill family, I think is more accurate, rather than saying a large number of hills. A large hill family that lived really more back up on the mountain, as I understand it, and if anyone has, because I've never been exactly clear, but the way most of the descendants tell me, they were more back up on Black Mountain, up that road, and then began to filter down as the church was built. Then they began to build homes around the church property. The progenitors then of the family were Ned and Priscilla Hill. Priscilla lived a really long life, reasonably well documented that she lived until, she lived until 1911, I believe it is, and she was about 100 and somewhere between 115 and 120 years old. But the story really, in terms of Strieby itself, really begins with a former slave from, actually from the Garner plantation, one of the Garner plantations, Islay Walden. He was the son of Branson and Ruth Garner, then they used the name Walden also. And that's a very interesting, I was talking about that earlier while we were waiting to set up. Most of the publications that you will see will say that his father was William D. Walden. Islay himself said repeatedly in interview after interview after interview, and on the marriage records of his first marriage, which I came across quite by accident in Raleigh, a woman who really, she just seems to flit through his life. My suspicion is she died. She seemed to be an older woman. He married her in 1869, and he says his father is Branson. In an article that appeared in a New York Evening Post article on his ordination in 1879, it explained that he said his father was a runaway slave who went to Indiana and was never heard from again. So, because I saw it so many different places, from him, really, I have completely set aside the idea that William Walden was his father. I think there was possibly a relationship. Exactly what that relationship is, I've not been able to document at this point. Walden was nearly blind, apparently born that way, but he was pretty much of a child prodigy. He could do very sophisticated mathematical calculations in his head, and the story goes that his owner would trot him around because he was sort of his personal calculator, and so when he was doing business he would take him so that he could make sure that the calculations were accurate. Walden spontaneously created a limerick, I would call it, a poem on the death of an ox that died rather ignominiously by being beaten for not doing what it was expected to do. Rather gruesome, but he did this sort of ode to this ox, and that apparently started his idea that he might be a poet, because his owner called him, he said, "My goodness, it seems you are a poet." So I'm sure he didn't really know what a poet was at that moment, but he learned as time went on. He worked in the gold mines. David, Kraft, gold mines. Where are they located exactly in that area?
In the Burkhead, there's the Dowd mines, Rush mine.
Okay. Was there ever a mine that was actually in that Strieby area, or not exactly?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
But
So it would have been maybe the Rush mine.
2 miles away.
2 miles away, okay.
Yeah.
So he worked in the gold mines. That's information for me because I was never quite clear on that. And he later worked in a hotel in Ashboro itself. And my guess is he met some travelers, possibly ministers, from the Reformed tradition or possibly from the Presbyterian tradition from the north, who suggested he come north to, one, get some medical help for his eyesight, eyeglasses specifically, and look into getting an education. He was clearly smart, why not? And around 1869 he does that, just that. He walks to Washington, D.C., as I said, stopping off in Raleigh and getting married and leaving us that wonderful record that, as far as I was concerned, solidified who his father was. He continues on to New Jersey, where a Reformed pastor was able to find a scholarship for him to return to Washington, D.C. to attend Howard School, to attend the normal program, and to become a teacher. And so by 1871, we have him back in Washington, D.C. and listed in one of the Howard University school catalogs as a student. In 1873, I'm sorry, I misspoke there. In 1873, he writes his miscellaneous poems. He actually graduates in 76. He writes something called his miscellaneous poems, which the author desires to dedicate to the cause of education and humanity. And although Walden is actually best known in literary circles as a 19th century African American poet. Mixed reviews, and I understand that. He's not Langston Hughes, but then he's a former slave with absolutely no personal history that he could draw on that would have him be as sophisticated as someone as a Langston Hughes. But he has a place. He has an important place in that the growth of those early intellectuals. But Walden doesn't see himself as a poet. Poetry is a vehicle for him. He sold these poems so that he could make money to go to school, so it could cover his expenses, so that he could do what he really loved, which was teach. And what did he do with that money? He opened what's called a Sabbath school. We think of a Sabbath school now as being like Sunday school, church. And I'm not saying there wasn't Bible studies, but for them, a Sabbath school, because people were working so hard during weekdays, on Sabbath after church, on Sunday after church, people would learn to read and write. And so he opened this Sabbath school to teach children, black children, and adults too if they wanted to come, to read and write. Being an educator was the most important thing to him. And going along with that, being an educator of the gospel. But it was really important to him that people learn life skills, that they learn about the arts, that they learn about music, that they that they put together benevolent groups, not necessarily societies exactly, but groups to look after one another, to look after their care. And that was the school that he started while he was a student at Howard was significant enough that an article was written 20 years after he died, talking about what a wonderful program it was. That's pretty amazing. When he graduated in 1876, he went on to, he went back to New Jersey, and he had actually applied to Princeton, and Princeton turned him down, and so these reform ministers said, but no, come over here, New Brunswick Theological Seminary, we're happy to have you there. And so he was one of the first two young men of color to be admitted, and he did it again. He started another Sabbath school. Again, very successful. He once again publishes poetry to help raise money for the school. This time what he calls his sacred poems. I'm sure not, influenced by this experience now in seminary. What I thought was interesting was that just as he's beginning his final year, he's in arrears on his payments to the school for his room and board and so forth. And he writes this very passionate letter to one of the deans saying that he understands that he's behind, but could they please give him some more scholarship money? Because he's used all his scholarship money on the Sabbath school. And it's really successful. And by the way, they're about to outgrow their space. They're going to need to rent another space, which is going to cost more money. But if he's going to graduate, he also needs money to catch up on his room rent, his gas bill, his, because he had such serious eyesight, he had what we would call a reader. He had someone to take notes for him, to read his books to him, to, sorry about that. I guess I have updates that I never pay attention to. And he needs to pay for all of this, and they won't let him graduate if he doesn't catch up his bills. And so he's trying, he says, listen, the school is really important. I can't, because of my eyesight and my limitations, I can't go out preaching the way the other students do. And so this is my only real ministry, but it doesn't make money, it takes money, and please, please, please give me some more money. And I guess they thought it was a wonderful letter and compelling, and they must have given him the money, because lo and behold, he does graduate in 1879. He and the other young men do graduate. However, the other young man, John Bergen, did not have a posting. He had nowhere to go to begin his ministry. Walden had signed with the American Missionary Association to return to Randolph County. So because of that, his ordination could go forward. And on, I believe it was July 2nd, he was ordained at the seminary. And as I said, a very large article appeared in the New York Evening Post explaining everything about his background, where he came from, his studies, his poetry, his family, and all the people who had supported him over time, and all the people who showed up at his ordination. And it's a who's who of the Reformed Church, and as well as the American Missionary Association itself. He starts his trip back to Randolph County, and he writes an article for the Goldsboro Messenger. He said, I told everyone I would tell them about my trip back, and let them know how I'm doing and what I've found along the way. He was very taken with Goldsboro, and he was particularly taken with, I found it interesting, Dudley. I didn't know a lot about Dudley, but in that time period, apparently Dudley was really thriving. As an African American community, people owned a lot of land, they were very successful, and in Goldsboro itself, there were, I've forgotten exactly how many schools, 4 or 5 schools, but they needed a high school, and they were begging him to stay in Goldsboro and start a high school there. They had a letter writing campaign, a petition going. I gather it didn't work because he came back to Randolph County, all to our betterment. By the summer of 1880, he had purchased the 6 acres that you see in the middle there for the church and had opened the first Congregational church of Randolph County. That's the original name of the church. That's the original church building, which stood until just around 1972. The school that he began, associated with the church, and I'll assume met in the church building originally, also included students from the Lassiter Mill community, which, as you know, goes along Lassiter Mill Road, along the Uwharrie River. Still on its property, and I'm not mistaken, I won't touch it because I don't want to upset the apple cart, but I believe, Albert,
You're
is that right?
right around the numbers,
Yeah.
298833.
298833,
That's correct.
I believe, is the lot that the last of the hill homes stands on. It is still there, hidden now. It's being reclaimed by the forest. I personally love to see it saved. That's the way it looked in 1982. I took that picture. It had a tin roof, porch was solid. I've been on it in the early 90s. Be quiet. In the early 90s. But at this point, it is surrounded by enough foliage, and I have this thing about snakes. So I don't go back there. In 1884, Walden applied for the community to have its own post office. That's because it was a pretty thriving community. There were quite a number of homes that were now being built around the school property, and there were well over 100 people living in that little enclave. There were over 35 children in school. There was a general store in that immediate area, and he thought, why are we going all the way up to the Lassiter Mill post office, which was way up the road? As I understand it, it was back up where the road to the golf course is, actually, in that area, which is a pretty good hike in those days. Thought didn't see why that should be. Thought that they should be able to have something right there for their community. He petitioned the government agreed. And in that petition, apparently, he asked for the name of the community, of the post office, to be called Strieby, which referred to a Dr. Strieby, who was an influential minister with the American Missionary Association. I'm on the hunt for a letter between the two. I can't. Strieby was at his ordination. I cannot help but think that somewhere in some uncatalogued, file, there is at least one letter between them. I'd like to believe so anyway. So I'm on the hunt for that. Shortly after the post office was designated, however, Walden died. In fact, an article appeared in the American Missionary magazine saying how wonderful it was that he had been able to get this post office, and that for Strieby, And he was actually dead at that point. And so the next issue then published his obituary. He died in February, pneumonia weather. We've been talking about pneumonia weather. Sure enough, he started off with bronchitis, and I'm pretty sure it turned into pneumonia. It took him out fairly quickly, as I understand it. He left a widow, a woman he had met, Eleanor Farmer Walden. He married again after the first wife, whatever happened to her, I'm not sure. But he married again a woman he met in New Jersey, and she followed him down here. And she was from New Brunswick, so she was from the big city, so to speak, but she came to the country. And she was their principal teacher, and she persevered. After his death, she did not leave. In fact, she got her sister to come down and marry one of the Lassiter relatives. She persevered with the help of another cousin, and this is the man a lot of people thought was the Walden that originated the church and school, but no, he came along quite a bit later. His name is Henry Ruffin Walden, and he was a Congregational minister in North Carolina up until the mid-1950s. Died in Highwood, I believe it was. He was a Hampton graduate, and she eventually married him, and they ran the school and the school at Salem, which was also an American Missionary Association school, Salem Congregational Church. She unfortunately dies in 1892, just as they were planning to open a secondary school. And it's sort of a confluence of things at that point. She dies, but economic trends have changed. We now have industrialization. We're starting to see factories open up. People are starting to move out of the community, be lured away for jobs out of the community, away from farming, away from the immediate area. The community slowly starts to shrink. So they don't build a secondary school. But the school continues, and it does fairly well, actually. In the book, I make a comparison between those in 1900 who say they can read and write, and signatures on their World War I draft records, men, just the men obviously, at the time. And I was struck that there was good agreement between those two records, that virtually everyone who said they could read and write, there was one person, and I can't help but think that it was kind of a fluke, because I know that person could read and write. Everyone who said they could read and write in 1900, and this person did say that in 1900, did sign their own draft record, usually in cursive. We hear that conversation now, right? They were doing it. They were doing it. Now, what do we mean by literacy? Obviously, I don't mean what we mean today, but we only have so many markers that we can point to. The fact is, it appears that people were able to do some rudimentary reading, writing, arithmetic, that people were going to whatever the school was offered. And school offered at that time period really wasn't very much. It was 4 months a year. That was the standard. They weren't unusual that way. It wasn't like, oh, these poor black children only get to go to school 4 months a year. Nobody was really going to school more than 4 months a year at the turn of the century. It wasn't until quite a bit later, closer to 1920, that they finally had upped it to what we now know as 9 months. And so, for everybody, literacy was a relative term. But what I noted in looking at some other research is that if you look at some other counties in North Carolina, they didn't have any schools for African American children, much less rural children. So this was a pretty big accomplishment. By 1920, all of the adults in the community marked that they could read and write. All of the school-age children in the community marked that they were in school, were marked as being in school. I think that's an immense accomplishment for any rural community, black, white, or green, in 1920. We're still struggling with these things in 2017 in rural communities, getting kids to finish high school and so forth. So I think this is a pretty big accomplishment. I fast forwarded, after 1920, in the mid-1920s, around 1923, the American Missionary Association pulls out because the public school system says, no, we'll take over some of these one-room schoolhouses, 1 and 2 teacher schools. And so they switch now to the county education system. So, you know, the parameter is different. But what I did notice in those people who were a monument to all those people who put their heart and soul into their life there, into their families, into their God, and into education. They believed education was important. And most of those people are dead now, but I can remember everyone talking about how important Strieby was as their foundational school and how it really launched them into their lives. Am I right, Patrice, your father and Aunt Kate and all of them, they would talk about it all the time, how important Strieby was. Fortunately, in 2014, thank you Randolph County Landmark Preservation, they accepted our application and designated it a cultural heritage site. The church, school, and cemetery, families still bury members in the cemetery there, and we still have an annual family event in August, on the 4th Sunday in August, which has been for as long as anybody can remember. What began as a revival week, but is now Homecoming Sunday. And that's pretty much it. The school doesn't stand any longer going back. It stood to the left here, I was told, on the land to the left here. If you go on the preservation site, there is a slideshow. Yes, Vivian! Come sit, come sit. There in the slideshow, there is a picture, and it is so marked. And this is in their memory. Thank you. Questions? Comments? Thoughts? Observations? Yes, sir.
Just a question, because I remember from some of the prior readings, Islay, the Reverend Islay Walden, his eyesight was very bad. Didn't he have it worked on, corrected some, either in New Jersey or Washington during one of those trips?
In Washington, but it was the kind of thing that really in those days in particular, I'm not even sure the exact nature of his condition. I haven't found any real discussion of his medical condition. It's just that they said he did come to Washington to get that medical help. And he wore glasses, and I gather it's what we would call functional blindness, or legal blindness, so he would be able to walk around and probably see things in shadow and so forth, but he couldn't really read. He had to have people read to him and that sort of thing. So he, once he knew an area, I'm sure he could walk around it without much trouble. Could he see the snake in the grass? Back to the snakes. I'm sorry. And I'm actually not afraid. I go out there. I hear people say, "Oh, there are snakes out there," and I go, "Yeah, there are."
Yeah.
But I go out there. But I'll assume he was able to figure out how to, they say we compensate. So if we can't see as well, we hear more keenly. We touch, we feel the movement of the ground under our feet. Proprioception, they call it, more clearly. So I'll assume that those senses served him well in that regard. But he could see a bit, but he couldn't read.
It's amazing, all the work
It is
he
amazing.
did.
It's phenomenal.
I had to read for him.
Yeah. The fortitude, the stick to it, the desire that he had. Just, I'm so impressed by that. Yes, others. Yes, ma'am.
I found it remarkable that Novella went up against that bus company in 1937 because they checked that was 18 years before Rosa Parks.
Yes.
Was there any
Yes.
backlash
Oh, sure.
in that community, the experience?
Oh, you mean in the Lassiter Strieby community against her for having done that? Why did you rock the boat kind of thing?
Yes.
I'm sure tongues wag, but you had to know Vella. You wouldn't have said anything to her face. That wouldn't happen. Oh no. Those of you who knew her, am I right, Shirley?
That's right.
No, you wouldn't have done that. She was just she just had such presence, and when she knew it was right. A little more about her. Vella went to Bennett. She graduated from Bennett in 1913. We have her certificate, her diploma. She went on to D.C. to D.C. minors teacher. I'll get it backward. Minors teacher college. There we go. And got her master's. She was, 1913. That's pretty independent-minded. Yes.
You mentioned being fond of Randolph County.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about yourself. Were you born in Randolph County?
No, I was not. I was born in New York City and raised in New York City. I'm a New York girl.
Okay.
I live in Silver Spring, Maryland now, though. And my mother is a descendant of the Lassiters. So I'm a fourth great-granddaughter of Miles Lassiter. And that's how I started it, was looking for more information on him. And, one thing leads to another, and there's always another story. Yes.
So that was really my question, is what inspired you
I'm sorry?
what inspired you to do the work, the research, the writing? Can you speak more about that?
I guess sort of natural curiosity. I've always had that kind of curiosity about family ever since I was a little kid. Usually I was pestering my father's sister, who was 10 years older than he was. And so she was born in 1894. And so she had all these great stories and she had pictures of all these old folks. And so she would tell me everything, and I remember I was only about 7 or 8 years old when she wrote down my Williams family history, complete with, biblical begats. And I just thought that was fascinating. And so I was always asking questions, but I would ask my mother, and she'd say, so let me back up. My mother wasn't born down here. She was born really in Greensboro. But they left there when she was very young and moved to Elizabeth, New Jersey. And she really never came back. So I would ask my mother these questions, and she had no answers. I don't know. I think everybody's gone. I don't know. Then, of course, I learned actually not from Roots itself, but from an interview with Johnny Carson from Alex Haley, that it was possible for me to actually do some of this research myself. I always thought you had to hire some person. Some library person somewhere in some dusty, stacks to do this research. And I was like, one day I'll be able to afford to hire somebody. And then I'm like, wow, I can do it myself. Well, I love to do that kind of thing. And I was walking through a Barnes & Noble, I'll give a pitch, through a Barnes & Noble, and there was a book about how to do your genealogy, and I bought the book. And I was in Washington, D.C., and the National Archives was right there, and the Library of Congress. And then I realized that a church member was a genealogist, and he was teaching classes at the church. So I took the classes, and there you go. And then I started pursuing all the information. When I would take information back to my mother, sometimes it would actually spark a memory that she had of a piece of information that made no sense to her until I brought her other information. Does that make sense? Like, she'd have the piece of information, so if I ask her directly, she has no idea what to say. But if I come and I say, Mom, I read this in this record, in the census, and so-and-so and so-and-so, and she'd go, oh, that's right. I remember so-and-so saying something about having a daughter named blah, 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 that kind of thing. So she would begin to piece things together, and then it would make sense for her, and then we could clarify things. Is that helpful?
How long did it take you to get this research and to write the book?
I've been at this since 1976. That's the short answer. That's not
I would
the
have thought.
that's not the real answer though.
Long time.
I wrote the first compilation we put together a family reunion in 1987, and my sort of first compilation on the Lassiters was in that 1987. Then as we would have other gatherings, I would update it. I would pester everyone, wouldn't I, Vivian? I would pester everyone tell me your children and who got married and what grandchildren you have and who did what and so forth, and add to the book. And I would add the research, and I'd add pictures that I took from the last time we gathered, and I'd put it together, all before you could do Photoshop or whatever. I actually don't do Photoshop, but I just do straight, from a straight photo gallery program. And around 1905, I realized I had enough information to make a real book. 2005, excuse me. I realized I had enough information to make a real book. And I began to put it together and come up with the way that I wanted to present it. Personal history got in the way at that point, and it sat on a shelf. And in early 2011, I was looking for an unrelated book. And I saw that it was by a particular publisher. And I went to that publishing site to see if I could acquire the book, because it didn't seem to be readily available at an Amazon. So I went to the publisher's site and clicked on that. And I was reading through, and I was going, wow, they have some really interesting books. And then I got to the bottom of one of the pages, and it said, so if you have a manuscript you'd like us to consider, email it. And I went, attach, email, click, and off it went. And that's how it happened. And the book was able to be published in December of 2011. That was the first book on Miles. Other questions?
Does the name Timmy McLeod ring a bell?
Yes.
Was she the postmaster after, or one of the first postmasters after?
Well, let's find out. Let's see if I can read it. Eleanor became the postmaster after Walden died, after Islay Walden died.
The information I found on Eleanor says she was there 1891 to 1940.
No. She died in 1892.
That came off the list similar to what you have there.
Yeah, no, she died in 1892, and her obituary was also published. And then Henry Walden remarried. It doesn't say that there. I don't see it.
Okay, 'cause that's Henry Walden's sister. Henry
Right.
Ruffin's sister.
Right, Henry Ruffin Walden. Henry Ruffin Walden then went on and married a woman from, I've forgotten exactly where, but not too far away. And she was a teacher, and she got a post as a teacher in another county, and so they moved. And I'm really not sure if he wasn't ordained yet, and I'm not sure if he was coming into conflict with the minister who was there. It's hard to say, without someone being able to tell you. It seemed a little odd that after spending all that time there, including Henry having finished it at Hampton and coming back and teaching in the area himself, that suddenly he up and leaves, unless his new wife didn't really like being there. Maybe that wasn't to her liking. That happens, and she said, I don't want to stay in the backcountry. I want to go to, because they seem to live in cities after that, and never really be in a country location after that. And after he's ordained, all of his charges were in cities. He was in Charlotte for several years, and then I believe it was High Point that he ended up dying in, right?
Yeah.
Yes, Matt.
This whole area of southwestern Randolph County
Yes.
was a gathering place for free people of color.
Yes.
And the Lassiters and the Waldens and Chavises, the Willows, and the Tones. And that was well before the Civil War.
Yes.
And I know from reading the WPA slave narratives, the slaves that they interviewed would often make a distinction between what they call the old order free blacks and the new issue free blacks.
That's right. Old issue and new issue.
And I wondered
And
if-
that throughout North Carolina and Virginia, that is always a subject of conversation.
Yeah, so I wondered if the original free people of color, was it a point of pride that they remembered in their families and perpetuated?
Yes, it was and it is still. Descendants still make a point of it. I'm not sure it gets you anything, you know, that, as we used to say in New York, that and a token. Of course, they don't have tokens anymore, but anyway, you know what I'm saying.
Well, it's interesting, I mean, I just wondered because, you know, here in Randolph County, we have lots of white people who were against the Civil War. And
That's right.
Ancestors were
That's
hiding
right.
out on Purgatory Mountain to keep
That's
from
right.
having the Confederate Army.
Yeah.
And it seems like nobody remembers that. You know, all those guys with Confederate flags in the back of their pickup, their ancestor might.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and apparently the women, you know, to the extent that that husbands were conscripted and had to go, sort of like it or not, or they ran off somewhere to hide. The women who stayed behind were apparently very rebellious and uncooperative and very in your face. Go women.
I wonder something about that. It was voted in Randolph County not to secede from the Union.
That's what I've heard.
150 to 15.
Right,
something like
but
that.
outvoted by the other counties.
Your family, I grew up in that exact neighborhood. That family was highly respected by my parents,
Yes.
and I go back a long time there and worked in the fields with some of the last.
Yes. Yes.
Do you know, it was Henry Ruffin Walden?
Yes.
You say he died in High Point?
I believe
Was
it's High
he a
Point, yeah.
Reformed minister or Congregational minister?
Congregational.
So was he at the Congregational church in High Point?
Yes.
Serving there?
Yes.
And he died in the 50s?
54, I believe it is. It's in the book.
His successor.
It's in the book.
His successor at the Congregational church there was the leader of integration in High Point.
Oh, cool.
And had all kinds of difficulty. They were ready to bomb his house and so forth.
Oh, wow. There are a lot of really interesting stories that have not been told, that have not been shared, that have not been uplifted, that it's great if we can, you know, anything you can do to share and uplift those stories. Yes.
When I was growing up, Mama told me about her growing up near Strieby.
Yes.
They had a farm, and she was probably 7, 8 years old. She would walk from the farm over to get the mail, and she, on the rare occasion when she might have a penny or two, she'd go to the store and get candy.
Aha.
She said the owner or the operator was Lige Shaw. And later, when,
Yes, I've seen the name in the census
when I
records.
was growing up in Worthville, she bought furniture from George Shaw
Oh, wow.
in Randolph, and it turns out he was Lige's nephew.
Oh, wow.
So they had known each other
For
many
years. Wow.
The farm was 90-some acres, and Grandma and Grandma separated. She sold the farm to Frank Allman for $20-some. Of course, this was back many years ago.
Still. I think she just simply wanted out, I guess. Woo.
That was Grandma.
Yeah.
She probably blew it in a month's time.
Anything else?
There's a rescue station that's just been built
Yes.
right at the corner of Strieby Church, and if I'm not mistaken, the Shaw family donated the land of that particular
Right, at the corner of Strieby Church Road and High Pine Church Road.
Years ago, I decided, I've heard Mama talk about Strieby, I want to go look at it. So I did. Turned up the little road, first house on the right at that time. There was colored fellows standing out in the yard, old. I stopped. We had a nice, good, long conversation, because he loved to talk, and I loved to listen. He said, now be careful, I just killed a rattlesnake while ago.
Yep. That's about right. That's about right. Make sure it's actually dead.
I wish I could remember his name, but I can't.
I'm not sure. I'd have to look, on.
Probably off the hill if it was on the right.
I think that's further up, though. He's talking about closer to High Pine.
To the highway.
Yeah, closer to
Turned
High
in
Pine
one
Church.
little ways, and there was a house on the right.
See but that's the land that London said was somehow in his family.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't know.
The Ruffin's granddaughter is a librarian in Alabama.
Wow.
Yeah. She was at
Wonderful. Wonderful. Anything else? Anyone else?
You might write another book with all this information.
Well, I certainly can expand, right? Yeah, well, actually, I am sort of interested in, at this point, I've gotten interested in some of those other communities. I've gotten interested in the community around Red House and the community around Salem Congregational School. So, church and school in both of those instances and make some comparisons. There are a lot of interactions, marriages between families and so forth. And ultimately those three schools became part of a combined school in the 1920s that was focused at Red House originally, and then of course it all became absorbed by the Ashboro school system. So I'm sort of interested in how those schools played into it, and that would probably be what I would pursue next, and try to, get more information about these stories. I'll be paying attention to the tape. I'll be taking my notes.
Well, Margo, thanks for coming down. And
Thank you.
You've got plenty of books.
Yes,
that
I've got
everybody
books.
needs to buy one and give one away.
I've got books. Entitled Chapter